Solvi is passionate about people and evolving the paradigm of culture and learning, focusing on technology, future skills, data, alignment, and strategies that makes an impact. She is currently the Director of Leadership at MISC, focusing on building leaders whom are champions for change, inspired by a fast-moving world, and able to build leaders for generations to come. She is also managing director of X.0 Consulting, working with governments, civic governments, semi-governments, and private organizations on the most critical issues facing organizations today. Most recently, Solvi was advisor to the chairman's office of the Department of Government Support in Abu Dhabi and dean of the Abu Dhabi School of Government, following her role with Columbia University in New York, where she developed and launched new postgraduate programs, master programs. Previously, Solvi served at several major international institutions as director, CEO of the Bahrain Institute of Banking and Finance, Asia Regional Director for the Richard Ivey School of Business in Hong Kong, CEO of Qatar Finance and Business Academy, Director of Program Management at Columbia Business School, and Associate Director of Wharton Executive Education at the University of Pennsylvania. Good evening, Solvi, and thanks for being with us. The mic is yours.
Thank you so much, Bassam. It's truly my pleasure and an honor to be with you all tonight. I have to be honest, INSEAD holds a very special place in my heart, because when I started my career at the Wharton School, I worked very, very closely with INSEAD, and throughout my career, I've had a chance to work with and on the campuses in Fontainebleau and Singapore, and with a number of the faculty. So not only am I hugely a support of your alma mater, but I'm always a supporter of individuals who take their ongoing learning and development this seriously and stay engaged with their universities. So thank you very much. It's a true pleasure for me to be here tonight. I want to start by asking you a bit of a question. I warn you, there will be a bit of engagement in this, so I'm hoping the audience stays with me. There will, there is Q&A, so please feel free to put them in, and I'll stop several times throughout the presentation to get questions that are relevant to those sections. But I want to ask you as individuals, how long do you think it takes for skills to become obsolete? The skills that you use every day in the job, the skills your team use, how long do you think it takes to do that? Now, I know we were planning to do a survey, and I'm not sure if from the technology standpoint, how we're doing that, but if you want to just put, oh, there it is, it's popping up. So please feel free to put your best guess in on how long skills take to become obsolete. Just a few more seconds. And that is, I guess, a critical mass of the people on the call, so we will take that. And we do even have a comment number in the comments. So it's a bit of a trick question, I'll be totally honest with you, because the answer, of course, depends a little on the industry, it depends a little on the individual, and a little on the circumstance. But as of about 12 to 14 months ago, data indicated that the average shelf life of skills was 18 months to 5 years, which is the tied answers in the survey results. So clearly you all saw me coming on this one. And that is a particularly interesting data point, because like I said, that data was relevant 12 to 14 months ago is when the information was largely coming out and was being discussed. And 12 to 14 months ago, we would have been having a conversation about the fourth industrial revolution, the impact of technology on industries, and the issues that we were all facing, trying to stay relevant and current in our roles, in our industries, because of that. Now, fast forward now, we're now 12 months later. If you just take that information, so we say the average shelf life is, say, 5 years, And you fast forward 5 years, we say the skills we have now, 50% of which are obsolete in 5 years and 100% of which are obsolete in 10. And why does that matter? Because we all know we will continue to develop. But what is most important and what is really interesting about this and really fundamental to the premise of our discussion here today, and a lot of the leadership work that we're doing at MISC, is not so much that the rate of change is faster, but that the pace of change is increasing. And COVID over the last 12 to 14 months has acted as a massive accelerator. In a market where the rate of change was fast and increasing, it's the increasing piece of it that makes it challenging, because we are moving from a world of risk where the world was changing, but we understood the pace and we understood the paradigm of the risk that we were dealing with, to a rapidly and increasing rate of change, which means we are genuinely now in a paradigm of uncertainty. And that acceleration, I would suggest, is a fundamental change that needs to go after the building blocks of what we are currently, of all of the markets that we're currently working in. Everyone has also seen the acceleration that COVID has brought upon us, especially in the digital context. The first line is my favorite in this graph, because it really talks about the idea, before COVID, again, 12 to 14 months ago, the best estimates were that it would take approximately 454 days for remote work or collaboration to be implemented. Post-COVID, organizations were able to get that up and running in 10. Multiple order of magnitude increase in the speed at which those issues became relevant. Of course, you can look at all of these are particularly interesting. Increasing use of advanced technology in operations went from an estimate of 672 days down to 26 and a half. And this is something that has happened globally. We are looking at, if you see this chart, the digitization gap has shifted us forward in time, an estimation of 7 years, in some cases, an estimation of 10. And this is true across all industries, even the ones that we considered stagnant and safe. So airlines and hospitality are now talking about fully digitized infrastructure that could mean fully digital hotels that don't have individuals in question. And so all of these things aligned really beg two fundamental questions. One, we've been holding ourselves back. Are we able to make these changes without an accelerant like COVID? And two, I would have to ask, has COVID made us incompetent? If you take the idea that the shelf life of skills is 5 years maximum in some cases, and you take the fact that we have jumped forward in time approximately 7, you have to ask the serious question of whether or not the skills that we went into last year with are currently relevant for us moving forward. Now, I realize that there are scientists and engineers in the audience today who are probably having a fit at a slightly inappropriate application of the transitive property, but I would still say that we have to look at the fundamentals of this and look at the idea of risk and uncertainty and how that has been affected by the fourth industrial revolution, digitization, technology, and now COVID, because we are looking at a situation where those two things, which are frequently used as synonyms, are very, very different ideas. I love to use this graph because it reminds me of my grandfather. I tell a story when I use it because my grandfather worked in a factory, and he worked in the factory for 35 years. And one day he became the manager of the factory, of his team. And I asked him what he did differently. And he told me that he learned what his boss did, and he did that for 30 years. There was no major inflection points, no major technological disruptions. And he was able, after his initial learning curve, to ride that through the bulk of his career. And that was true of my grandfather and my father, and many of your family, I'm sure, fall into this category. But what we are now realizing, that as the future is coming at us at a much faster rate, we are looking at a learning curve that does exactly the opposite. We are looking at a learning curve that goes up, continues to go up, and goes straight up for the foreseeable future. And again, that is directly linked to the idea of long-term unknowable uncertainty. And so I'm putting all this together, much of which I'm sure many of you know, because we are now in a position as leaders in government, of industry, in our own organizations, of saying, how am I going to lead when I don't fully understand what's going on? How am I going to lead in an infrastructure that I don't understand, technology that I don't understand? We came out of 2008. If we think back to the 2008 financial crisis, some of the most revolutionary technologies, platform-based admittedly at that time, disrupted known quantity industries. Airbnb, Uber, non-industry players were massively disrupted in very traditional industries. If we think coming out of a transition of this significance isn't going to be similar, I think we're being naive. And the reason I'm saying this all in this context is, as leaders, as individuals, and as leaders within our organization, we have to own that fundamental truth of that paradigm shift to uncertainty and say, what do I need to do to upskill myself to be prepared and manage that going forward? And I would suggest that in 5 years, no one can tell you what you are going to need to know. No one. Anyone who tries is lying. Most of the children in elementary school now will enter the job market before we retire in jobs that don't currently exist in all of our industries. So there's simply no way we know what we need to know 5 years from now. What we need to learn now is how to think, how to approach this idea. Because and many of you have seen this graph before of the iceberg, most of us spent our education and have spent most of our careers above the waterline. We learn models, we learn technical skills, we learn formulas, we learn frameworks that all work in a world that has relatively predictable risk, none of which work in a world that has completely unknowable uncertainty. And so what I would suggest now, and what we're going to talk about today and what we're dealing with at MISC, is work below the waterline. How do we think and how do we make decisions? And that is our philosophy and our approach to leadership. And so, excuse me, thinking about thinking. Like I said, no one can tell you what you're going to need to know in 5 years. What we need to know is how to interpret, analyze, and apply information. As I mentioned with the chart with my grandfather, there is more data being generated today in one day than in my grandfather's entire lifetime. Your grandfather, my father, that is just how it is. But we are products of an education system. Even recently, when we talk about INSEAD, we talk about IMD, we talk about all the major schools, the models that we're talking about, many of which are excellent, are based on knowable risk. And we teach students too often what to think, but not how to think. We don't teach them through a model of how to interpret, analyze, and apply information. That uncertainty that I keep talking about, and you will want to kill me by the time this presentation is over because it is so fundamental to this for me, represents unique and novel ideas that don't necessarily fall into the frameworks and formulas that we've been given. And so what do we need to do? We have to go back to thinking about thinking, the way we think. Meta-thinking, metacognition is not new. It's most often associated with John Flavel from 1979, but it is now much more actively being engaged with curriculum development, and I would suggest needs to be engaged with leadership development. For those of us who think back to, and I know there's at least one engineer in the audience today, but when we were in school, we were taught models of thinking. Engineers are a great example of that. Accounting is another example of that. The scientific method is another example. But many of us were never even taught a thinking model. We didn't study philosophy. We didn't study critical thinking necessarily. We studied formulas and models. I would suggest that has become, those models, those thinking frames that we either learned or adapted for our own, have become habits that we now call great instincts. It is now something we think that because of our experience in the industry creates these instincts, and that's true to some degree. But I would say we need to take a step back, look at our own assumptions, and in this case, those assumptions are our thinking models. Go back to what that model was and say, what are the assumptions there? What are the frameworks there? How has that become a habit And that has become my instinct, because that is how we are going to critically shift to a world of uncertainty and be prepared for the future that is already here. So what we are doing at MISC in our Leader 2030 program and in others is focusing on the idea of mindsets, models of meta thinking, of learning how to think, learning of different ways of thinking, and then critically learning to shift between these thinking methods consciously. So we're engineers, we learn a model, that becomes a habit, those become the instincts. I am suggesting we go back and expand on those thinking models, which with practice will then become habits and better and broader instincts. But if we don't go back and examine this, the models we have are no longer fit for purpose in the underlying assumptions and the world that we're living in. And so how to learn metathinking, learning about mastering thinking, blueprints or mindsets. I think it is possible to learn how to learn again, to learn how to learn these mindsets again. Many of us learned them consciously the first time. Those of us who didn't, new skill for us. But if we go back and look at the idea of an entrepreneurial mindset, a consulting mindset, a scientific mindset, an innovation mindset, these are different frameworks. They're different structures that can be taught, that can be practiced, can be mastered and learned. And all of a sudden, we're expanding extensively on the skills, the tools, the habits, and then our instincts that we take and apply and bring value to our teams in that unknowable and uncertain future. Now, in this particular case, I'm going to talk a little bit about the project we're working on because it's directly relevant to this. And I think very exciting because if I am myself, I had a business degree with a music minor. So I am a bit of a little half crazy creative and a little half business school, but I don't think I had the structure around the thinking that I wish I'd had. I was asked the question today, actually, for Women's Day, if I were to have gone back and done anything different, what would it be? And I said I would go back and study philosophy, critical thinking, because it is a mindset shift of questioning, and that creative questioning is what we need. So what we're suggesting now in the model and the program that we're developing is individuals to go in, reprogram themselves with these different mindsets. And the one I'm particularly excited about in this particular case is we are actually taking individuals in one of the modules of this to CERN in Switzerland, to the Large Hadron Collider in Geneva, which is the most scientifically advanced infrastructure in the world with the smartest scientists in the world, and taking the scientific mindset and applying it to business, to government, to everyday context, which is one example of the way that we're going to be applying new mindsets and helping people master these new blueprints, which will then transition through, inshallah, to their everyday experience. Now, I would like to get people involved in this discussion a little bit. When you think about entrepreneurial thinking, scientific thinking, creative thinking, consultative thinking, what do you think about? And so if you could give me words, again, either in the Q&A box, I think they're going to pop up another survey. Give me words that pop to mind when you think of these things.
Solveig, there will be the possibility of using the chat to answer the questions.
Okay, great. I'm looking for. Yes, I'm looking for the chat. The chat box is open if people want to put their ideas in there, because I think it's important that we critically evaluate what do we think these things are. We tend to think that our blueprints, our mindsets are the correct ones or the fundamental ones. And I'm wondering how people view their own and others.
So if you allow me, Solveig, to answer these questions, for me, the entrepreneurial thinking is about the possibility of not only problem solving, but thinking outside of the box, the ability to see a gap in the market between the supply and demand, and then trying to fill that, which is the entrepreneurial thinking in general. And I could say that it's also could be implemented inside, the government, semi-governments, and private sector in big corporates, where you take a direction from inside the corporate, expanding into a new business line, business model, new products. So I think that's the entrepreneurial thinking. While the scientific thinking, the way I see it, is that, as you mentioned, is that you use models that's been developed, and you continue using these models regardless of their timeline.
I appreciate that. Thank you. And I think what the key piece of it here, you mentioned with entrepreneurial thinking and creativity, I think a lot of people are concerned that, these are things you have or you don't. They're instincts you have or you don't. They're preferences you have or you don't, and whether or not they can be taught. And one of the fundamental premise I view about leadership in general, and these mindsets in particular, is all of these things can be taught. They take a bit of mastery and they take a bit of skill, but they can in fact be taught and individuals can learn them and create them as part of their toolkit, and something we are calling at MISC intellectual flexibility. And that that the new tools, when practiced, creates that intellectual flexibility. If you have the ability to choose and be dynamic with that, which creates better habits and creates better instincts. Another comment that was made is entrepreneurial thinking, risk-taking, try it. And that is incredibly important, because especially right now, we're talking about, again, the unknowable, uncertain future. And to have that level of ambiguity means people have to take risks in order to try new things, to find out what is going to succeed. And that is fundamentally a shift in many ways in organizational government cultures in the region and, of course, globally. Now, So that is the first piece that I want to talk about, related to the two-pronged model we're talking about of the leadership philosophy. And that intellectual flexibility is all of the different models the mindsets that we talked about, and the ability to continue to evolve those over time. Based on the initial data that we talked about, I can't possibly say that what we're talking about here is the answer moving, far into the future. But I believe it is an answer right now to help adapt to the new reality. Now, shifting that intellectual flexibility is the mindsets. And now we're talking, and then the flip side of that is behavioral flexibility and the ability to make decisions in new ways. I don't know how many of you in the audience have had exposure to competency models. I'm sure we've all had the available competency models within our organization. And if we were going to do another poll right now, which we're not, but if we were, I would ask you, how many of you consciously use your competency model in your decision-making processes? I know when I thought of that question, I laughed a little bit at myself, because I can't honestly say I've ever had a competency model I was familiar enough with that was actively engaged in my decision-making process. And I've been the leader of a number of organizations, and I know they have been built. I know some of them are excellent, but this is one of those moments, again, that risk versus uncertainty, that inflection point of history, that I'm going to suggest that the competency models that we all know and love, while important, are no longer the effective guiding principles they're meant to be. The competency model is meant to be a guide for leaders to help guide their decision-making and ultimately have impact within an organization. Having said that, they are usually siloed, monolithic, focused on a particular ideal that is built on the knowable risks associated with a reasonable steady state environment. We are not dealing with that anymore. We're dealing with the unknowable uncertainty of a rapidly accelerating future. And in which case, it's impossible to make decisions, as we all know, based on a monolithic approach to an ideal. We've got to be more nuanced in the decision making. We've got to have a polarity, a spectrum in our decision making that's acceptable within an organization for us to be competent and credible leaders, because individuals, our teams know that these are not always possible. So we have to have a much more nuanced approach to our decision making and the competency models associated with that. And so, we know also, if you make a decision to move forward, you cannot go back. We have to deal with not just the decisions we make, but the implications that have of the decisions we cannot make and the choices we cannot make. And the reason I bring this up, because one of the greatest examples that we've seen in the last year demonstrates a singular fixation of an organization or in an industry that has proven to be no longer compatible with the environment we now live. And the industry I'm specifically talking about is actually logistics, supply chain. We have, as a global citizenry, focused the last, 10 years on the idea of the leanest possible supply chain, the most efficient possible supply chain. And what we learned in the last year is that leanness and efficiency leaves for very little resilience. And resilience is not the opposite of efficiency on this particular chart, but it is in that particular industry, except we have an industry full of people who know how to be efficient, but do they know how to be resilient? Are their organizations able to be dynamic enough to say, oh my God, we've got to build that into, so our leadership can make decisions on that continuum for our very survival? Organizations, all of us, whether we work for government, private sector, ourselves, or someone else, in the last year, I'm almost willing to bet everyone on this call has taken whatever goals they set at the end of 2019 for 2020, threw them out the window sometime around June or July, and survival was the dominant, was the dominant need. But is your competency model, are your behaviors and skills dynamic enough to be flexible in that? And knowing that the world is going to remain rapidly changing and uncertain, is your model sufficient to move forward? We all like to think at the end of this year, we'll be vaccinated, we'll be back to normal. But are we willing to say, are we naive enough to say that this could never happen again, and therefore we're going to go back to business as usual? And so we have to create a dynamic, and this is what we call in this context, behavioral flexibility for decision making that allows leaders to be dynamic, moving into the uncertain world, in the uncertain future that we have. And the last piece on this particular one that I want to talk about is owning those personal styles, because we have, as individuals, we take pride in our styles. We have preferences, and that is fine. But what we have to now make the distinction about what is a style and not making a judgment on a different style, not making a judgment if people are now moving across these continuum, making the ability to allow ourselves and other leaders within our organization to be as dynamic as they need to be in order to be successful, because preferences and styles should not be mixed up with values. We should not be making value judgment on that, especially in the marketplace as dynamic as it is right now. So those are the two key fundamental pieces that we are looking at in the 2030 program at MISC. And it really is all about intellectual flexibility, how we think and what we think about, and behavioral flexibility, how we make decisions and the decisions we choose. Why is this important? We all know why this is important. Pre-COVID, this was important. We still had Brexit. We still had, God help me, the US elections, which I can speak about as an American, but I choose not to. But the world has been dynamic and changing rapidly. Fourth industrial revolution happened long before COVID, but even more important than all of this, we're talking about Saudi. We're talking about the Vision 2030. His Royal Highness is a visionary leader, and we had a vision and a rapid rate of transformation far before any of that even happened. And in order for us to realize any of these things and develop cities out of the desert, to develop infrastructure that doesn't exist, industries that don't yet exist, we have to have skills that don't currently exist in a more dynamic way as individuals, so that we can lead these projects, we can move forward with this, because 2030 isn't the deadline. 2035 isn't the deadline. 2040 is not the deadline. We're talking about needing to be leaders into the foreseeable future and bring up our teams who will succeed us in realizing these and making the legacy that His Royal Highness has put in place. Now, at MISC, I would be remiss if I didn't at least refer to the project I've been talking about the whole time. We are putting in place a whole portfolio of leadership development, but specific to a target audience, an audience like yours, we're putting in place the MISC 2030 Leader Program, which is focusing on senior leaders who have accomplished things in Saudi Arabia, who are positioned within organizations and government that have 10 plus years of experience, but know that in order to take their contribution to the next level and success to the next level, they need the new skills, some of which we've talked about here today. We're looking at solving large-scale socio and economic challenges, driving the change in the kingdom with a unique competency model that has that flexibility and is respectful of tradition, history, and culture, and still can drive agility, change, and a future focus. Gaining those diverse and strategic insights to inform transformation at scale, creating those different mindsets I talked about, and creating an elite group of senior leaders who have that infrastructure and network to have a language and experience to call upon each other when they need help to realize to solve the challenges that they're facing. The program we're launching has 5 very unique and distinct characteristics. It does have a careful selection process. It is not an automatic nomination, and we're hoping everyone will apply. It is, the pilots for cohorts 1 and 2 are fully funded by MISC. So we really do hope that we can find a diverse group in Saudi Arabia, diverse geographically, demographically, and intellectually and experientially, so that we can have a robust classroom, learning experience, transformational curriculum that we've talked about, which is the intellectual flexibility, the mindsets, the unique competency model, which is the behavioral flexibility, the world-class ecosystem, which I'll talk about more in a moment with our partners, and a lifelong alumni community, which is really the value, as a group like this knows better than anyone. You can call on people who've had that same experience because they understand what you're saying and the experiences that you've had. The project itself is 5 modules, 4 of which are in KSA, 1 of which is in Barcelona and Geneva, as I mentioned at CERN. It talks about all of the different components, all of the different mindsets. It will be applied to a capstone project that will be directly linked to the vision realization projects and offices. It will focus on coaching, not only as having coaching, but as a mindset to take back to the organization. And there will be ongoing electives and optional modules for continuous development throughout and post the program. It starts in the last quarter of this year, and we will be going through, the first cohorts will be launching in the last quarter of this year. Applications are starting now and will be ongoing through 9 months into next year. And so I want to thank you very much for all of your time. I really appreciate it. I hope at some point we'll have the opportunity to discuss all of the leadership philosophy, because it really is, I hope you can tell, a passion of mine and something that I hope we share.
Okay, thank you, Solvi. It's time for questions. So far, there are no questions yet. That means one of 2 things. Either it was extremely clear for all the attendees, or no one had understand anything at all. And I hope it's the first one. I have a question for you, Solvi. So now, it's very interesting about the program. And, we believe that lifelong learning is important as we develop. The question would be, okay, so there's the program. We encourage all to apply for the program. But for those who are, for one reason or another, are not able to apply for the program, from your experience, how we would be able to work on the intellectual flexibility and the behavior flexibility?
Well, the first piece, to your point, I mean, I do hope everyone has the opportunity. Like I said, it is funded by MISC, and it will be running for the next 4 or 5 years. This is not just this fall. It will be doing 4 cohorts a year for the next several years, at least 4 to 5 is the current plan. And so we're hoping at some point people are able to build that in. But for those that are not able to do that, I do have a number of ideas. Now, of course, INSEAD knowledge is a great source of information. But there's a number of other publications in that space. I would probably, though, be very specific and targeted in the information that you seek out, and starting with, well, I would start with maybe a style assessment or a personal assessment, as we are doing in the project, to determine, what models are you currently using, what styles are you currently using, and preferences that you currently have, because sometimes we're a little blind to those, and getting a feel for what those are. And then two things I would recommend. One, if you are super daring, jump into the opposite end of the gene pool. No, like, Bassam, I happen to know you're an engineer. If you were, I would probably tell you to go for, the innovative mindset, or, an entrepreneurial mindset, something that is an artist, follow an artist around. Find a different approach. And myself, I want to follow around an engineer or a scientist, because it's a far more structured approach than I have historically used. And so I would say, if you're daring, find someone who does something better than you do in a model that you respect, and try to emulate that. Try to find out and break down the component parts. This isn't about an overnight revolutionary change. This is about incremental decisions and steps that we have to take consciously, and that's hard, because these are habits. Like I said, these models have become habits that we now call instincts and think we're brilliant. And we are in many ways. We're just not quite as broadly brilliant as we need to be. So we need to develop some new habit, consciously make some choices that develop new habits and move from there. And there's a number of, of course, there's HBR, that I dare not say on an INSEAD podcast, event, but
that's okay. We all read it.
Say, yeah, exactly. Look broadly and look. No, I am a big fan. I'll be totally honest with you. Of a few recent publications. There's a book that recently came out by Rita McGrath that actually came out fall of 2019 called Seeing Around Corners. I think that's an excellent approach to revisiting the idea of strategy. And it very much comes from an alignment of, it's about communication, it's about cultural alignment, it's about the shifts in the market, as the paradigm shifts, the points of inflection, and how we have to adapt to them. So I highly recommend that. And then another one called Humanocracy. Gary Hamel, I want to say, is the author. He came out of LBS. There's two authors there, but it's another one. Again, it's talking about teams, it's talking about cultural alignment, it's talking about a different thinking paradigm as related to kind of our modern issues. So those would be two references I would recommend.
Okay, thanks. So Solvi, if possible, to share the presentation with the people and along, if you can send us the two books that you have recommended, so that we will share it in the same email. I have a question here from Jonathan Howard saying, some of what you said reminded me of when people talk about design thinking. Is there a relationship?
I think there is. Now, design thinking, of course, I don't pretend to be an expert specifically in design thinking, but I do know it has a big place in mindsets, in scenario planning. A lot of what we're talking about can also fall into the area a bit of scenario planning, because it is about trying to, scenario planning is exactly what it is. It talks about what are the potential scenarios. We talk about COVID as a black swan event, and the truth is it wasn't. Bill Gates was talking about it 5 years ago at TED. We just didn't want to believe it, because no one could possibly believe something like this, of this, this significance could happen. But, design, and design thinking is about taking a different model. The design thinking model is about taking a different approach to problem solving. So I would consider design thinking, again, I would want to dig into it a little more, as one of the potential pieces of a mindset you would approach to. I know design thinking features heavily in innovation. It features heavily in entrepreneurship sometimes. So it's probably a component part of both of those. And it would be, to your first question, either design thinking, I think would be a good skill. If someone is looking what to do, that's a great place to start. System thinking, design thinking are all good parts of that toolkit.
Excellent. Another question from me, about the 2030 Leaders Program specifically. So how can we apply for the program? Is there like a website? Is there a link, or is it not open yet? When does
No,
it?
there is a website. I will ask actually Reem if I can to put that in the chat, but what I'll make sure is that is in the presentation when we send it out so that everyone has that link in the presentation, and we'll try to put it in the chat here so people can check it out directly.
Excellent, excellent. Okay. So as a summary, Solvi, you shared the two important and fundamental skills all leaders of the future should consider acquiring. The first one is the intellectual flexibility related to meta thinking of how we think about thinking and how we develop different mindsets and thinking patterns for different situations. And the second one is the behavioral flexibility related to how we manage opposing priorities, balance paradoxes, and make decisions in time of change. These are the core of the design of the 2030 Leaders, a MISC developed and sponsored program for senior Saudi leaders who want to make an impact and lead transformation efforts at scale. Another question from Jonathan saying, is the program for Saudis only?
In fact, everybody, all of a sudden, I think they realize we're leaving. They start asking questions. Yes, unfortunately.
Yeah, now all the questions started pouring.
Yes, yes, unfortunately, the program is for Saudi nationals only, but it is for anyone in the private or public sector. With, obviously they have to go through the application process, but it is available widely across all of the industries of Saudi. Can you highlight again the books that I recommended? Sure. Which are the book Seeing Around Corners. It came out by Rita McGrath. She's a faculty at a Strategy 50 thinker and a Columbia faculty, and that came out in 2019. And then Humanocracy. I believe Hamill is one of the authors of that. I'm blanking on the author's name, but it's a bright yellow cover. It's hard to miss. It's all about shifts in, culture shifts and how that is a strategic alignment with that within an organization. And then Mohammed asked, before the pandemic, most organizations moved to we're moving at a steady pace. People wanted either proof of success and you feel a great sense of urgency to invest. That is certain. I do love that one chart that talks about the acceleration from 53 days to 10 is my favorite of all of the data points I've seen, I think, so far. COVID-19 was, of course, an accelerator to that. What other angles or dimensions do you see being disrupted at the same or greater pace? This might be a little bit self-serving only because it's the industry I know best, but I think we're going to see, I'm hoping we see education make those kind of radical changes. Now, education, of course, is an industry that is wildly regulated by a whole host of different levels of organizations, ministries, accreditation industries, and the rest. But I think my personal opinion, and this is my personal opinion, so this isn't MISC, this is just me. I think what we're going to see in education is a massive disruption by non-industry players, similar to what we saw coming out of 2008 with the arena players, platform non-industry players. I think we're going to see in education a massive disruption that comes from non-traditional sources. And it could be Google, could be Amazon, it could be, because, and the reason I say this, and I'm not saying necessarily K through 12, because again, they're so highly regulated. But one thing is proven without a doubt: the educational infrastructure, as we have seen it and as we know it, is no longer fit for purpose. And that is another 3-hour lecture I can give, which I will not do now. But what we have seen is, because, and this isn't new, but it's now available again through platform and wide access, non-industry players have the reputation and visibility and access to information that will allow them to provide point of work, point of need, micro learning. Learning is fun and relevant and necessary when it's something you need right now. If you can find something to do what you need right now, that is the most impactful type of learning. And you're starting to see through nano credentials, micro credentials, and a market that is starting, and I think COVID will accelerate this, to recognize that the degree as the currency of skill is flawed. We should be focusing on the skill as the currency of work or the currency of education versus the degree. And I say this as a woman with 2 degrees, and I work in the education industry. I know this is heresy, but that's a very long answer to your question. And I'm happy to talk at another point, but I think education is going to be wildly disrupted. I think we know, I don't think we even know how wildly disrupted hospitality and transportation is yet going to be. I think the Microsoft announcement last week with the whole holographic digital engagement, like is going to make Zoom seem obsolete even in a year from now. So I think we're not going to be going back to kind of the same level of travel, at least not for business, that we used to. Aside from reading, I'm sorry, more questions keep popping up. If you don't mind, Bassam, I'll take it.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely.
Okay. Aside from reading certain book or relevant materials, does the MISC program offer placement opportunities for its candidates to develop hands-on experience to enhance the desired skills? We do have a host of programs, some of which will have a little more job skills development. I would recommend reach out to us. We're happy to have some of those questions, to field those questions. That's a really precise question, and we're happy to have that on an individual basis. I represent only one of 4 tracks within MISC. There's also career development, which may or may not be a better fit for that particular question. And so we're happy to have that conversation with individuals to help guide them. Is there a kind of similar program you recommend to check out for non-Saudis? To be honest with you, and I know this is going to sound wildly arrogant, I think, and yes, I helped develop this, but this is one of the more innovative programs I have ever seen, and I've done this job for 20 years. I think the partners that we're working with, we're working specifically, Asade is our dominant academic partner. We're working with Accenture, Towers Perrin Watson, CCL, Minerva, are all components of it because we didn't believe any one partner could deliver the depth we wanted in all of these different mindsets. And of course, CERN that I mentioned before. And so unfortunately, that ecosystem of partners literally doesn't exist anywhere else to the best of my knowledge. Now, yeah, so I want to say yes, but I just don't. Now, having said that, I absolutely believe in the value of a lot of what the exec ed providers are providing in the smaller programs. So you could theoretically go to a smaller INSEAD program or a smaller IMD or, even Mackenzie's, there's a lot of different institutions that are focusing on pieces of this. One of the things I would actually recommend, and a big piece of this will be the coaching mindset, because there's of course a huge shift culturally in managerial styles to coaching, mentoring. And so getting a coaching certification or getting work in that space, you can take some of the pieces out. I would humbly suggest they won't be as good as the whole, but I do still recommend people take the time to invest in the component parts.
I'm sold. Where is the website to apply?
The link is in the chat. Marie put the link in the chat, or Mishari put the link in the chat. So yeah. I recommend people go there. I am the director of the program. I'm happy to talk about it. You have now seen me go on about it for nearly an hour. So at your own peril, ask me to talk about it because I will go on. But we do encourage everyone to apply. And I do sincerely hope, because, and I know where you were going a moment ago, my last words are, I do what I do because I have never been more inspired by what I've seen of the visions in the Middle East in general and the KSA specifically. The Vision 2030 and His Royal Highness are some of the most visionary and impactful initiatives in the world. And I would argue modern human history. At what point in your life where else are you going to be able to say, I did something that helped build a nation, that helped change the world? And part of the reason I choose to be in the region is be able to contribute there. I don't expect one day to be remembered that I was here, but I know that I helped do that. And that's what gets me out of bed. And that's why we built this. And hopefully, inshallah, if people engage with us on it, that passion, those skills will then be transferable back into the vision projects and whatever comes after those, which I cannot wait to see, because they are given how exciting these are, those are going to be otherworldly.
Okay, Solvi, if you have last and closing notes before we close this session.
Well, really, I mean, I can't say much more than, what I am thrilled by I'm honored to be here with you, and thank you all so very much. I hope the group took some value from the conversation, and we hope to see some of the applications. I think it is an exciting project that is supporting an even more exciting nation building enterprise, and I hope we can all be part of that.
Excellent. So thank you, Solvi. By this, we have reached the end of the session. Thank you all for attending. And again, on behalf of INSEAD Alumni Association in Saudi, we would like to thank our guest speaker, Solvi. You've been brilliant. Thank you very much. And thanks also for those behind the scene for making this session possible. Rabi' Abu Kashik, Reem Thawadi, Mshari Abu Khair, and our Zoom champion, Adil Baraja. The presentation of this session will be sent by email along with the two books recommended by Solvi and the link to apply for the program. Thank you, everyone. Good night and goodbye.